I'd like to turn to a more broader question. So we've addressed some of the technology and the opportunities there, also as a challenge because we don't have some of the tools and the systems to put them all together. But I just came from the World Food Prize last week in Des Moines where the talking point about trying to feed 9 billion or so people by 2050 was repeated on and on about all these different things that we need to do in order to address that challenge ahead. So Larry, I'd like to turn to you a little bit, both in the U.S. and around the globe. What really do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities for conservation looking ahead?
Someone on the previous panel mentioned the notion of sustainable intensification. And I think those two words, sustainable intensification, are big challenges for us. We certainly get that we've got to grow more food per acre in this world. We also get that it's probably going to take more acres in production to meet those demands. But somehow the conservation community, the entire world community needs to come together and figure out how do we do that sustainably? How can we grow our food? How can we reach 300 bushels per acre corn and yet still reduce the Gulf of Mexico dead zone or other dead zones around the world? There's hundreds. And so we have to do this in a way that's sustainable. And at the same time, I think a big conservation challenge for us as we think about the next 30 or 40 years is where is the appropriate places to develop agriculture and yet leave some ecosystem still intact so that the services that ecosystem provides to agriculture and the entire world can function and we can still have a healthy planet. So, it's sort of big picture, but those are some really big challenges that we have to get at, I think, as a global society. And North America, I think we certainly have to try to lead that.
And do you see CTIC playing a role more globally?
I think so. More and more it seems like we're talking about international events that we are working on. And certainly this model, and I have to go back 30 years in the early 80s when CTIC was developing. I was just coming out of college working at a soil and water district and remember CTIC being developed, and so I've been very good friends with Jim Lake. This notion of public-private partnerships, it's a model that is exportable around the world. And I see it when I've worked in Brazil, where you have the public-private partnerships going on there, and it's certainly a model that we need to export.
Jerry?
Yeah, I think that as we think about feeding 9 billion people and the amount of food that it takes to do that, there's some very sobering parts of this puzzle. And it goes back to Frank's comment about water, is to grow 300 bushel corn from where we're at today will take another 5 inches of water transpired through that plant. Extra yield does not come free. So it's going to take more water, and Jane mentioned it in the last panel, and I'll bring it up as well, is that we also are now going to move into a period of greatly unsettled weather around the world. Climate variability, for climate change, over the next 10 to 20 years is going to wreak havoc with how we thought about managing soil. We're going to have extreme events of temperature, extreme events of rainfall, and if our soil doesn't have the capacity to absorb that water, hold that water, make it available, we're going to see more and more food insecurity around the world than what we've had. Now, I get accused of being very pessimistic and delivering a doomsday talk, but I think we have to face reality. But what it really comes back to in all of this is we need to be paying very strict attention to building the soil resource. We have to build the soil resource in terms of organic matter, the soil biology, all of those pieces, because the future of humankind depends upon us stabilizing the soil resource. And the other sobering statistic, if you look around the world, we're still in a degradation slope of soil. We continue to degrade our soil resources. So we're going to have to reverse a very big trend in terms of managing our soils better, improving that. It'll solve a lot of our problems in terms of not only production but some of the environmental quality issues. But we're going to have to really rethink how we do this. And I'll just, one of the examples that I think about for Africa is that, you know, we would like the African producer to improve organic matter, but in reality, the residue that's left on that, the manure that comes from that, is their fuel source. Would we be better off providing them fuel oil for cooking so that the residue could remain for going back into the soil? I mean, we're going to have to rethink everything because I think we're going to, but I don't think we'll rethink those until we really hit some very crisis moments of just how we're going to do this.
Well, we're certainly investing a lot of money in Africa and other less developed countries trying to figure these things out. But do any of you have a sense that there's a coordinated, comprehensive effort to do so? Dan? I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Well, on the technology of how to produce, my sense is that Gates Foundation, for example, has made a major effort in this arena, and other foundations as well. And in that regard, I think that we're delivering fairly well. It is important to understand, and I would preface my comment by, and it's not egotistical, North American farmers are still the best, the most productive farmers in the world. But you can't take a North American system and lay it over a developing country. It's impossible. It doesn't work. But there are certain key things that we can go and teach, and the kind of things that Jerry's talking about in terms of soil health. This is something that I feel fairly passionately about, that the United States here, because of our presence in the world and because of the strength that we have in our agricultural industry, could be a significant world leader. I don't believe that we need to do it completely alone, but we could be a significant world leader in terms of things like improving soil health. As Jerry pointed out, we are still even degrading soils here in the United States, so we've got our own work to do. And we can get at that, and we must get at that. But clearly, there's things that we know, we understand, we have the research, the scientists and so forth, we have the technology that we can help deliver to those developing countries that would fairly significantly change the soil profile. And we have to understand that man only survives, I think Earl Butz said that man is here because of 6 inches of topsoil spread evenly around the world. And the fact is that it's true, and if we don't take care of this resource that we frankly, in the U.S. government, we've talked about air quality, we talk about water quality, we have not historically talked about soil quality, and yet soil quality is measurable. And if we do soil quality well, air quality and water quality is enhanced by definition. So there's some real opportunities here, and it seems to me that the United States, this is one area where we could really lead.
I'm going to let Dan respond, and then we've got a question over here if we have a microphone. Dan?
Well, everyone in this room, I'm sure, would agree that our soil is one of our nation's greatest resources, and in fact, one of the planet's greatest resources. And yet, the degradation we've referred to, and we're all people who are here because we're passionate about saving that soil resource and improving it, yet, as Jerry mentioned, we've watched the quality of our resource in this country degrade over the last 50 to 100 years. And in our neighborhood, the first farm that my wife and I bought when we started farming, soil organic matter on that farm was around a little under 2%. If you went to the fence row and took a probe out of there and tested that, you'd find that the what I would call the equilibrium or natural state of that soil should be around 6 to 7%. In a relatively short amount of time, we've degraded that. And I'm not going to go into all the reasons why that's important, but the good news is, as Jim just mentioned, that when you start to focus on organic matter as your metric and the goal, it's measurable. So we can put real values on the effort to improve it. In our case, 18 years of no-till corn and beans, and this is before we got heavily into using cover crops manure, we were able to double that organic matter back up to 4%. Why is that important, and how is it that we're going to get mainstream farmers to accept this as a goal? Well, we know that for every 1% of organic matter in the top 12 inches, there's 1,000 pounds of nitrogen. And in a typical year, we'll mineralize naturally 3 to 5% of that. So, or excuse me, 2 to 4%. So at 3%, that 2% organic matter that we've picked up in 18 years, which is a short time in the soil's life, at current nitrogen prices is worth $40 to $50 a year in inputs that we don't have to go off farm and buy and risk running down the tile lines. That 2% organic matter allows us to store an extra 32,000 gallons of water, gallons of water per acre. That's equivalent to 1.25 inches rainfall roughly, which this year in August was worth quite a bit. These are real numbers, and when you and the previous speaker and I got nervous because I thought steal my thunder here, but this is something we can go out to landowners. An increasingly large percentage of the land in this country today is owned by people that have no physical connection to it. And this can be a problem, or in this case, it may be an advantage because, you know what, I can probably sit down with a room full of folks, the farm club wives of Chicago, and explain organic matter and why it's important on our farm, and how it'll add value to their farm, and they'll get it quicker than a group of farmers. Unfortunately, I hate to say that, but there are a lot of folks out there with preconceived notions that just aren't open to that. And so I think if we can focus on organic matter, all these other win-wins come in: water quality, air quality, reduced need of outside inputs, all comes together. And I think really, if there's one thing we could accomplish over the next 20 years, both domestically and globally, it's to educate the world as to the value of organic matter in our soils and how to maximize it.
And set a national goal for improving soil quality. Just put the metrics in writing and do it. We set other goals, and this is one that, frankly, the agricultural community can take upon itself and win in a major way.
Good point. And I want to come back to the importance of educating people about this goal and how we might do that, but we have a question here. And Rob, can you please identify yourself?
Yes, Rob Myers with the USDA Sustainable Agriculture Program and agronomist at the University of Missouri. So Dan, I just wanted to pick up on your comment about biological solutions. I sit on our state NRCS technical committee and have for a decade, and I've seen them move towards a focus on using bulldozers for terracing to having more biological solutions. So could you say a little bit more about what opportunities you see with cover crops or other approaches? And Jerry, you might want to pick up on this too, given the research your lab does. Thank you.
Sure. Well, Bruce, I think it was mentioned earlier, we need to bring livestock back to the farm. And while I agree that that brings many opportunities, I would submit that we already have livestock on our farm. We just don't acknowledge it. The microbes are the livestock of the soil. They're what takes what's in that environment and breaks it down and feeds the plant. So our focus is when I talk about biology, is based on providing a good atmosphere for those microbes. You hear corporate creeds based around making a good workplace for employees. We feel the same way about our microbes. So you talk about technology, the first thing is most microbial populations need oxygen, which means they want an aerobic environment, which means we have to provide proper drainage solutions in order that they can have oxygen throughout the year. The good news is we have wonderful new technology to do that. We can now go out and do a topo survey of a field and design drainage systems on the desktop. I can proofread them. I'm not the guy that installs them, but I can check every line to make sure it's where I want, the right slope, right size, before I hand him that card to go out and do it. Why is that important? Well, if we're going to have an active biological system, they've got to be able to breathe. And so that, and in most of our soils, and this is not a one-size-fits-all thing, but in most of our soils, that's the first step to getting active biology. And then, you know, of course, we want to have something growing all the time. Whenever something's not growing, the microbes are starving or they're wanting for something. So corn and beans really only actively grow roots and feed that rhizosphere for about 3 months of the year. You know, the sun is our free resource, and we waste it 9 months of the year when we could have it feeding a plant, which is in turn feeding our livestock in the soil and putting carbon back in the soil. So that's probably the second thing we're really working on in conjunction with our cash crops. And unlike every other farmer, I have to pay a competitive cash rent or make my land payments. So, you know, this is not done being divorced from the reality of economics. In fact, though, what we found is it becomes a win-win. That when you start to do these things and develop a healthy soil, a biologically active soil, economics proves favorable in a number of ways. So drainage, providing something active biologically to be going on there all the time that we can in our you know, part of the world in Indiana. We realize stuff's not going to grow 365 days a year. We can get closer than you might think. And then you've got your fertility, and you know, as Jerry and I were discussing, I love manure for that reason. We try to use manure as our primary fertility source whenever possible. That may not be possible for everyone, but those are some of the things that we're doing on our farm to encourage biological activity and diversity.
Jim and Jerry?
Okay, Dan, you just gave a dissertation that frankly a lot of farmers wouldn't be able to do. And I think, to your great credit, how did you, and I also know that you didn't come up through the, quote, agricultural colleges of this great land. So someplace along the line, you learned some things. I think this is important in terms of us looking forward. Sorry to take your job for a second, Sarah, but I'm going to ask the question, how did that happen in your circumstance? I know the answer, okay? But I'm curious, and I think it's important for Dan to share how he came to that level of knowledge and understanding, because this is essential.
A good lawyer or moderator never asks the question they don't already know the answer to. Well, I didn't leave the farm thinking I was going to come back. I studied finance, and I won't bore you with the whole story of how we ended up where we are, but I think the number one thing that's helped me is I came back ignorant, without preconceived notions, and with an eye towards numbers and science, that if I had a problem, I sought information as solutions. And those information sources have changed a lot, even in my short time. The initial source was a man that we both revere, David Swain, who is our agronomist. And David had a real eye towards all the things we're here to discuss. And the network of his customers that he established and put us in touch with through usually biannual meetings was initially probably the best resource that we had. Another network that I was able to tap into was Jim Kinsella. I think one of the farm magazines put on a contest to transition to no-till, and I wrote an essay and was invited to join. And that group, which Mr. Hatfield had a large influence on the thinking of, was instrumental in helping me start to think about how to manage what's going on below the ground. Most farmers manage on what they see above the ground, and Jim was the first one that really got me thinking about managing roots and what's going on below ground, and now expand that to not only the roots, but the biology, the things we can't even see physically, and how everything we do impacts them. Today, these networks of other producers, I've never invented anything in my life. I don't even have a lot of original ideas, but when I see something working, I'm pretty good at stealing it, bringing it back, and making it work. And so, you know,
Time-honored tradition.
yes, John Deere, you know, they're living proof of that, right? Sorry.
We'll let our John Deere friends ask questions in a bit.
One of the things I enjoy most about farming is reaching out, going to meetings, finding other producers who are really sharp and doing something really well. I'm a pilot. I love a good excuse to fly anywhere, go to their place, see what they're doing, you know, try and see what we can bring back. And now, of course, we've got the internet, and that's good and bad. There's a lot of great things out there. There's information at your fingertips, whether you're in your farm office or whether you're with your iPad in the tractor on auto track, auto steer going through the field. It's all out there. The problem there is you've got to be able to filter a lot of that. There's a lot of junk out there too. So there's an important skill set that I think if we're going to ask our kids to be techies and go out in the information age and get this information, we need to make sure we teach them the critical thinking skills to separate the chaff from the good stuff. But all those things, mostly it's human interaction though that's helping me. And I've had, you know, 20 minutes from Purdue University, and I make a lot of jokes. I'm an IU grad, about IU, Purdue, and occasionally poke fun at some of the findings that come out of the land grant system. But in honesty, there's a lot of great people there, Jane and some of her colleagues that I've worked with that have helped me, a guy who's not very smart when it comes to chemistry and some of these things, understand physically what's going on so I can think through those processes, and that's been a big help too.
Well, I want to continue to drill down on the information thing, but Jared, do you have something you want to add to this before we?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a visual image of this. Dan and I were talking about this at lunch, but it's a concept that I've been working with on producers. If you look at the upper foot of soil in a really healthy high organic matter soil, about 4%, we have the equivalent of 2 African elephants living underneath that soil surface in the upper foot. And if you had 2 African elephants per acre walking around your farm, the first thought you'd have every morning is, how are you going to feed those elephants? And if you had that same thought about all of that biology underneath your soil surface, and saying, if you woke up every morning thinking, how am I going to feed these stupid elephants, you know? If you've got to think about it from that standpoint, then you're going to say, I'm going to think about organic matter, I'm going to think about this residue, because they're eating roots constantly. And so I really focused on just how do we begin to think about management of the soil biological system, and looking differently at our soil system, not from a physics perspective, not from a chemistry perspective. Start with the biology, because a healthy biological soil also will save itself in terms of the aeration problem, the nutrient cycling problem, a number of different things that happen from that. So I think that once we start thinking about that way, then a lot of the other things that change within our soil. But unfortunately, soil biology is the last thing we think about. We want to manipulate soil mechanically to achieve a certain structure. We want to manipulate it chemically to achieve a certain goal. We don't think about letting biology do all our work for us. And I think some of that, and I give another talk on just the arrogance of mankind, or humankind, about how we've manipulated our soil to achieve the goals that we want, in reality not working, letting the soil do what it really is designed to do. Going back to the fence row. If you look at what the fence row can do for us, I mean, it's a perfect example, and I'll give you a fence row example. We have harvested yields out of a fence row, simulated fence row, this year of 290 bushels in central Iowa.
Wow.
That tells you what you can do when you think about a high organic matter soil, lots of water holding capacity, a lot of nutrients, everything else in there. If you can do 290 in a year like this, think what you can do in a good year. You know, so that says that there's a lot of undiscovered secrets in this soil that we better start figuring out, because, as Jim pointed out, we don't always have 6 inches of soil uniformly distributed around the world. And it's getting less than that. So,
Well, you've brought up some interesting numbers as well as given me new thoughts about the elephant in the room.
that's really the elephant in the room story.
Yeah.